Have you ever smiled at the man trying to bury your career, while your fingers brushed one single piece of paper that could ruin his life? The most lethal corporate secrets are not locked in armored safes. They lie gathering dust in forgotten cardboard boxes down in the basement. Pour yourself a strong cup of coffee, because I am about to tell you how a throwaway project turned into a death sentence for a truly terrible boss. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for tuning in, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's episode, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you can listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description and pinned comment. Now, let us start today's story, where you will follow the corporate nightmare of a woman named Natalie Alexander. The air in the Viridian Estates open plan office always felt like recycled ambition, but on that particular Tuesday, it was thick with sickening adulation. Regional Director Marcus Thorne was parading through the aisles, basking in the applause of sycophants. He had just successfully slashed 20% of our regional operating costs, a brutal bloodletting of essential services and junior staff that management chose to brand as visionary leadership. While everyone else clapped and offered empty congratulations, I kept my eyes glued to my monitor. I already knew I was about to become his next casualty. Marcus stopped dead at my desk, and the celebratory chatter around us immediately dialed down to an expectant, suffocating hush. He did not hand me the new assignment. He dropped it. A heavy, dust-stained cardboard box hit my pristine desk with a dull thud, sending a small cloud of ancient paper particles drifting into the sterile, air-conditioned breeze. He leaned in, his lips curling into that signature half-smirk that made you want to punch him squarely in the jaw. "Natalie," he announced, projecting his voice so the entire floor could hear every single syllable. "I have a special assignment that requires your unique attention to detail. We need the Vanguard Tower physical archives digitized. I know you are absolutely perfect for this corporate archaeology job." A few of his loyal middle managers chuckled from the sidelines. The message was loud, clear, and utterly humiliating. I was being publicly sidelined, stripped of my active duties and banished from the core projects. Vanguard Tower was a dinosaur, an old, decaying commercial high-rise we had acquired in a messy merger over a decade ago. Its basement archive was legendary within the company, but for all the wrong reasons. It was a chaotic, disorganized graveyard of overlapping legal paperwork, neglected maintenance logs, and dusty filings from the past 10 years. Nobody wanted to touch it. It was pure administrative exile. I looked up at Marcus, behind his tailored Italian suit and expensive cologne. I could see the cold mechanics of his corporate survival kicking into gear. The vice president's seat for the Midwest region was opening up in exactly 6 months. Marcus wanted that leather chair desperately, but my team's recent portfolio yields had been quietly outperforming his direct initiatives. I was a highly competent, rising threat. He could not outright fire me without just cause, so he chose the classic corporate suffocation tactic. He was going to bury me alive in useless paper, hoping I would either quit out of sheer frustration or simply fade into complete irrelevance. The old me, the naive professional who still believed in corporate meritocracy, might have stood up and argued. I might have demanded an immediate meeting with human resources or pointed out my stellar quarterly performance to the entire floor. But I had spent enough years navigating the shark-infested waters of commercial real estate to know that a public confrontation was exactly what Marcus wanted. He wanted me to look emotional, uncooperative, and insubordinate. He wanted to document a bad attitude to justify his actions. So, I gave him exactly what he did not expect. Absolutely nothing. I did not sigh. I did not glare. I simply offered a polite, hollow nod. "Understood, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "I will get started immediately." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, clearly disappointed by the lack of a spectacle, but he quickly recovered, straightening his silk tie and walking away to accept more praise from his followers. I quietly packed up my laptop, hoisted the heavy cardboard box into my arms, and walked toward the freight elevator. The descent to the sublevel felt like a slow funeral march, the fluorescent lights flickering violently as I sank deeper into the concrete bowels of the building. When the heavy elevator doors finally parted, the smell of damp concrete, stale air, and rotting paper hit me like a physical blow. Row upon row of rusted metal shelving stretched out into the dim light, sagging under the immense weight of thousands of forgotten files. It was an isolation chamber designed to break my spirit. I set the box down on a cold metal table. I smoothed my skirt, took a deep breath of the dusty, heavy air, and felt a strange, freezing clarity wash over my mind. I was not a victim to be cast aside in the dark. Marcus thought he was sealing my tomb, but he was fundamentally arrogant, and arrogant men always leave a trail of mistakes. If he wanted to force me to dig through the dirty, discarded trash of his past operations, then I was going to dig as deep as I possibly could. I was going to see exactly what kind of dead bodies this company had buried down here. Down in sub-level 3, the silence was absolute. My smartphone screen displayed a grim 0 bars of signal, completely cutting me off from the world above. For the first few days, my existence was reduced to the rhythmic, mind-numbing sound of paper shuffling and the blinding flash of the flatbed scanner. I was tasked with categorizing thousands upon thousands of invoices, vendor receipts, and maintenance logs spanning the last 5 years of Vanguard Tower operations. The dust coated my throat, making every breath taste like old chalk. But as the hours bled into days, my brain, trained to analyze market trends and spot financial anomalies, refused to shut down. I was not just scanning, I was reading. And the deeper I went into the chronological filing system, the more a very distinct, deeply unsettling pattern began to emerge. I laid out 2 stacks of financial ledgers on the cold metal table. The stack on my left represented the first 2 years of the 5-year period. During that time, Vanguard Tower had a standing contract with a premium, heavy structural engineering firm. The invoices were massive, detailing specialized inspections of the load-bearing columns, the elevator shafts, and the seismic damping systems. Then, I looked at the stack on my right. Exactly 3 years ago, right around the very month Marcus Thorne took over management of the building to pad his regional portfolio, those expensive structural maintenance invoices abruptly vanished. They did not just decrease, they completely stopped. In their place, a new vendor appeared. I squinted at the faded ink on a crumpled invoice from just 2 years ago. The letterhead belonged to a company that, upon closer inspection of their listed services, specialized in cheap residential plumbing and basic electrical repair. It was the kind of outfit you would hire to fix a leaky sink in a suburban kitchen, not a firm you would trust with the structural integrity of a massive commercial high-rise. Yet, according to the documents I was holding, this obscure residential repair company had been signing off on the annual technical safety and structural compliance reports for a building that stood 60 stories tall and housed thousands of corporate employees. A cold shiver snaked down my spine, chilling me far more than the basement air. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. No legitimate, state-licensed structural engineer in their right mind would ever allow a residential plumber to authorize safety certificates for a skyscraper. It was not just negligent, it was dangerously, criminally reckless. I frantically dug through a fresh box, pulling out the most recent annual safety inspection report filed just 8 months ago. At the bottom of the page, there was a signature accompanied by a state engineer certification number. I grabbed an old Ethernet cable hanging from the concrete wall, blew the dust out of the port, and plugged it directly into my laptop to bypass the lack of wireless signal. I accessed the State Licensing Board public registry. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I typed in the first certification number. The database returned a glaring red error message. Invalid entry. I tried the second number from the previous year. Another error. I pulled up the report side by side on my screen. The certification numbers were not just fake. They were clumsily constructed. completely sequential digits that someone had lazily copy-pasted from a basic spreadsheet generator. Before I could process the magnitude of the fraud staring back at me from the screen, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor groaned open. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive Italian leather shoes echoed against the concrete walls. I instantly minimized the registry window and dragged a random document into the scanner software. Marcus stopped right behind my chair. The suffocating scent of his cologne overpowered the smell of damp paper. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not check the boxes. He simply stared at the back of my head. "I hope you are not getting bogged down in the details, Natalie," Marcus said, his voice echoing with a cold, metallic menace. "Your job is to feed paper into a machine. You just need to scan them into PDF files. Do not waste company time actually reading that garbage. None of it matters anymore." He lingered for a few suffocating seconds, ensuring his intimidation tactic had landed, before turning around and marching back to the elevator. I listened to the doors slide shut. My heart hammered against my ribs, but a slow, dangerous smile crept across my face. If Marcus had simply left me alone, I might have just flagged the discrepancy to the compliance department and let them handle it. But his blatant, heavy-handed prohibition was the worst mistake he could have possibly made. He was terrified of what was in these boxes. His warning did not scare me away. It was the spark that ignited a blazing fire of obsession. I was no longer just an exiled employee. I was a hunter, and the scent of blood was overpowering. For the next 3 consecutive nights, I did not go home. When the rest of the office cleared out by 7 o'clock in the evening, I stayed behind, waiting for the heavy footsteps of the night security guards to fade down the opposite corridor. As soon as the coast was clear, I engaged the heavy deadbolt on the inside of the sub-level door. I was completely sealed in. My objective was no longer just scanning random invoices to satisfy a fabricated quota. I was hunting for the holy grail of commercial real estate documentation. I needed the original foundational agreements. Specifically, I was tearing the archive apart looking for the Vanguard Tower Comprehensive Risk Insurance Contract, signed back in 2012. The search was grueling and meticulously slow. I moved hundreds of pounds of paper. My hands blackened with years of accumulated grime. My eyes burning from the severe lack of sleep and the harsh, unforgiving glare of the bare bulbs. By 2 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd night, I was running on pure adrenaline and cold vending machine coffee. I had finally reached the darkest corner of the basement, a section directly beneath a massive, sweating utility pipe. A steady, rhythmic dripping over the last decade had completely corroded a stack of cardboard boxes sitting at the bottom of a forgotten wooden pallet. I dropped to my knees on the freezing concrete floor, ignoring the dampness seeping through my tailored trousers. I clawed through the rotting, waterlogged cardboard of the bottommost box, buried beneath layers of moldy utility bills, protected only by a thick, heavy-duty plastic binding cover. My fingers brushed against a massive block of paper. I pulled it out with extreme care. It was a dense, 200-page legal binder. The title page, though warped by the moisture, was perfectly legible. It was the Master Comprehensive Insurance Policy for Vanguard Tower, executed in 2012. I dragged the massive binder back to my metal table. The overhead fluorescent tube flickered wildly, casting long, erratic shadows across the concrete room, but I barely noticed. I began to read. I devoured the dense, suffocating legal jargon, my mind cutting through the convoluted syntax like a surgical blade. I skipped past the standard liability clauses, the weather damage protocols, and the general maintenance minimums. I was looking for the absolute structural bedrock of the agreement. On page 142, buried deep within a heavily worded section concerning catastrophic risk mitigation, my eyes locked onto a specific paragraph. Clause 44B. I read it once, I read it twice, I read it a 3rd time, tracing the printed words with my index finger just to make sure I was not hallucinating from severe exhaustion. The language was absolute, ironclad, and unforgiving. The clause explicitly mandated that the seismic damping system of the tower, the massive critical internal mechanism designed to keep the 60-story structure from snapping in half during an earthquake or severe windstorm, had to undergo a rigorous physical inspection every 2 years. Furthermore, it strictly dictated that this inspection could only be performed by a fully independent, state-licensed structural engineer. But the final sentence of Clause 44B was the real kill shot. It stated, in unequivocal legal terms, that any fraud, misrepresentation, or willful omission of this specific inspection process would result in the immediate and total nullification of the entire insurance policy. Worse, it would automatically trigger a mandatory report to the Municipal Zoning Board, resulting in the immediate revocation of the building certificate of occupancy. I sat back in my chair, the heavy silence of the basement ringing loudly in my ears. All the disconnected puzzle pieces suddenly slammed together to form a horrifying, beautiful picture. In his ruthless pursuit of cutting 20% of operating costs to secure his upcoming promotion, Marcus had not just made a questionable management decision, he had actively engaged in gross corporate fraud. By firing the legitimate engineering firm and hiring a cheap residential plumber to fake the safety certificates, Marcus had triggered Clause 44B. He had secretly and entirely voided the insurance policy on a massive commercial skyscraper. If a catastrophic failure occurred, or even if a minor structural incident led to a basic insurance claim, the provider would audit the safety logs. They would instantly discover the fake certification numbers I had found just days prior. The insurance claim would be denied outright. Viridian Estates would be entirely unprotected, exposed to hundreds of millions of dollars in direct liability, lawsuits, and potential wrongful death claims. The city would force the immediate evacuation of thousands of commercial tenants because the building was technically illegal to occupy, and Marcus had crossed the line into a federal offense. A profound, intoxicating wave of absolute power washed over me, completely erasing my physical fatigue. My hands, which had been trembling from too much caffeine and nervous energy just moments ago, were now perfectly steady. Marcus Thorne had smiled when he threw that cardboard box onto my desk. He thought he was assigning me a meaningless, degrading task to force my resignation. He thought he was burying me in the dirt. He had no idea that he had just unknowingly handed me the very rope I would use to hang him. The noose was tied, the trapdoor was set, and I was the only one standing at the lever. The temptation to march straight up to the top floor and slam that insurance binder onto the desk of the chief legal officer was nearly overwhelming. I had the smoking gun, but a cold, calculating logic quickly extinguished that impulsive fire. In the corporate ecosystem of Viridian Estates, human resources and the legal department did not exist to protect the truth. They existed to protect the company. Right now, Marcus was the golden boy, the executive who had just saved them millions of dollars. If I walked into that office with a cardboard box full of accusations, Marcus would simply claim I had stolen confidential files in a desperate bid to save my own failing career. He had the executive authority to have the documents shredded before the sun went down, and I would be escorted out of the building by security, branded as a corporate thief. I needed a weapon that could not be suppressed. I needed to build a trap so airtight that by the time he realized he was caught, there would be zero room for negotiation. So, I started playing a very dangerous, high-stakes game of two faces. During the daylight hours, I was the picture of a defeated, obedient drone. I dragged my feet. I avoided eye contact in the break room. I sat in my freezing basement and dutifully scanned the most harmless, inconsequential documents I could find directly into the official company cloud storage. I fed the system endless streams of old landscaping contracts, catering receipts from 5 years ago, and useless marketing brochures. I gave Marcus exactly the data trail he wanted to see, a steady stream of meaningless compliance. But the moment the clock struck 7 in the evening and the heavy security doors locked the rest of the staff out, my real work began. I stopped using the company's scanner entirely. Instead, I brought in my personal tablet equipped with a highly specialized, military-grade document capture software. It was completely offline and heavily encrypted. Under the dim, flickering basement lights, I meticulously photographed every single piece of damning evidence. I captured the forged, sequential engineer certification numbers in high resolution. I documented the invoices from the cheap residential plumbing company, and I took perfectly framed, crystal clear images of every single page of the 2012 insurance binder, paying special attention to Clause 44B. I was building a shadow archive, a digital guillotine constructed entirely of facts. My biggest breakthrough, however, did not come from the cardboard boxes. It came from the digital graveyard. While cross-referencing the fraudulent vendor payment dates, I accessed a legacy internal server, an old email archiving system that the IT department had practically abandoned during the merger. I ran a targeted search using the fake vendor name and Marcus as the sender. After 3 hours of scrolling through endless digital trash, I found it. It was an old internal email sent by Marcus directly to the head of regional accounting, dated exactly 3 years ago when the vendor switch happened. The message was brief, arrogant, and entirely damning. Just approve the expense for the small repair company. Marcus had written, "Stop asking questions about the structural firm. We need these margins up by the end of the quarter, and insurance will never come down to check anyway." I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse hammering a steady, triumphant rhythm in my ears. Up until this point, Marcus could have potentially argued gross negligence or administrative incompetence. He could have claimed he did not know the plumber was not a real engineer, but this email was different. This was premeditated, documented malice. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he knew exactly what he was doing. He was deliberately bypassing safety protocols for a quick financial win. I downloaded the raw email file, complete with the embedded metadata and IP routing tags to prove its absolute authenticity. Now that I had my arsenal, I needed an impenetrable vault to store it. I used a secure, encrypted browser to set up an anonymous cloud server hosted in a privacy jurisdiction overseas. I uploaded everything, but I did not just dump the raw files. I spent hours organizing them into a flawless, undeniable audit report. I linked the fraudulent invoices directly to the state registry error codes. I attached the email screenshot right next to the mandated terms of Clause 44B. I created an executive summary that laid out the exact timeline of the fraud and the total financial exposure of the company. It was a masterpiece of corporate destruction. Finally, I needed an insurance policy of my own. If Marcus somehow got tipped off or noticed that the structural files were missing from the physical boxes, his first instinct would be to wipe the digital footprint from the internal servers. I opened the back end of the company intranet and wrote a silent, passive tracking script. I anchored it specifically to the server folders containing the vendor payment history and the old email archives. The script was designed to do absolutely nothing unless someone with executive credentials attempted to modify or delete those specific files. If Marcus tried to cover his tracks, the script would immediately lock the files, trigger a silent alert directly to my encrypted phone, and create an undeletable backup log of his exact keystrokes. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark basement. The bait was set. The weapons were loaded. Every exit door was firmly nailed shut. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. 2 weeks later, the suffocating monotony of the basement was shattered by a company-wide email that sent shockwaves through the entire corporate hierarchy. Viridian Estates had just publicly announced a colossal acquisition deal. They were selling Vanguard Tower to a ruthless, top-tier investment conglomerate based out of New York City. The purchase price was a staggering $500 million. The atmosphere on the executive floor transformed into an absolute frenzy of greed and anticipation. Marcus Thorne was suddenly walking on water. He held daily briefing meetings where he paraded around the conference room like a conquering emperor, loudly boasting about his brilliant operational strategies. He had managed to package a decaying commercial property and sell it at a premium. Everyone knew what this meant. The moment the ink dried on that final contract, Marcus was guaranteed a 7-figure performance bonus, and that coveted vice president chair would be formally handed to him on a silver platter. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. But a $500 million transaction does not happen over a simple handshake. The New York investment group was not going to wire that kind of money without completely dissecting the asset first. They deployed a massive team of legal representatives and elite forensic auditors to Chicago to conduct the final due diligence. These were not the lazy internal compliance officers Marcus was used to pushing around. These were apex predators of the financial world, paid exorbitant sums to find every single hidden liability before their clients assumed any risk. They needed total, unhindered access to the operational history of Vanguard Tower. This was the exact moment Marcus made his final, fatal miscalculation. To facilitate the due diligence process, the New York team required a virtual data room, a highly secure, encrypted online portal where they could review every contract, maintenance log, and insurance policy at their own pace. Setting up this portal was tedious, highly technical administrative work. Marcus, too busy picking out the leather for his new corner office and rubbing shoulders with the board of directors, delegated the task. And who better to organize the digital files than the quiet, broken woman who had spent the last month categorizing the physical archive? He summoned me to the main floor just long enough to drop the access credentials onto my desk. "Set up the data room for the New York auditors," Marcus commanded, not even bothering to look me in the eye. "Upload the digitized Vanguard files. Make sure the interface looks clean. Do not mess this up. Natalie, we are at the finish line." He thought he was delegating grunt work to a defeated subordinate. He did not realize he had just handed the keys to the entire corporate kingdom to his executioner. The countdown had officially begun. I had exactly 48 hours before the final closing meeting, the high-stakes boardroom gathering where the auditors would give their final blessing and the funds would be transferred. For those 48 hours, I did not sleep. The adrenaline surging through my veins was a powerful, electric stimulant that kept my eyes wide open and my mind razor-sharp. I locked myself in my apartment, staring at the glow of my dual monitors in the pitch-black room. I logged into the virtual data room using the administrator credentials Marcus had so carelessly provided. I uploaded the clean, sanitized files just as I was instructed: the standard leases, the approved architectural blueprints, the harmless vendor contracts. I built a beautifully organized, perfectly standard data portal that would easily pass a superficial glance. But underneath the sleek user interface, in the back-end source code of the data room itself, I went to work. I was not a software engineer by trade, but I knew enough about web architecture to build a digital tripwire. I wrote a highly specific, customized script and embedded it directly into the directory tree. The logic of the code was wonderfully simple. It lay completely dormant while the New York auditors browsed the standard folders, but I programmed a specific trigger condition. If any user with external auditor credentials clicked to open the directory labeled Structural Inspection and Insurance History, the script would instantly execute a back-end override. Instead of pulling the sanitized, clean files from the official Veridian server, my script would aggressively reroute the data request. It would reach out across the internet, unlock my anonymous offshore cloud server, and forcefully pull down the shadow archive I had built. It would bypass the standard viewing window and force a full screen, unclosable presentation mode on the end-user device. I ran simulation after simulation in my dark apartment. I clicked the dummy folder, and every single time, the screen instantly flooded with the high-resolution scans of the forged signatures, the damning email from Marcus, and the highlighted text of Clause 44B. The execution was flawless. There was no lag. There was no way to stop it once the request was made. On the morning of the final meeting, I took a long, scalding shower. I put on my sharpest charcoal suit, tied my hair back into a severe, immaculate bun, and walked into the Veridian Estates building with a chilling sense of calm. The air was buzzing with the electric anticipation of a massive financial victory. Caterers were carrying trays of champagne and expensive pastries toward the executive boardroom. I took my seat in the back corner of the room, tasked with providing technical support for the presentation screen. Everything was ready. The digital time bomb was armed. strapped directly underneath the polished mahogany table of the board of directors. The timer was ticking down its final seconds, and I sat there, quietly breathing, as the only person in the world holding the detonator. The executive boardroom was a fortress of polished glass and imported mahogany, packed tightly with the highest-ranking members of Viridian Estates and the formidable New York investment syndicate. At the head of the massive table stood Marcus, his teeth gleaming as he aggressively pointed a laser pointer at the projection screen. He spent 20 minutes walking the room through the flawlessly optimized profit margins, bragging loudly about his streamlined operational costs and visionary leadership. The suits from New York nodded, their faces unreadable masks of corporate calculation. Finally, the lead auditor, a silver-haired man with terrifyingly sharp eyes, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. "Impressive numbers, Marcus," the lead auditor said, his voice cutting through the smug, self-congratulatory atmosphere. "Let us finalize the compliance checklist. Pull up the directory labeled Structural Inspection and Insurance History on the main screen. Please, we need to verify the seismic certifications before we authorize the transfer of the $500 million. Marcus confidently waved a hand in my direction. "Natalie, open the file." Sitting in the shadows at the very back of the room. I smiled. I rested my index finger lightly against the enter key on my laptop. I took one final, deep breath, and I pressed it down. The custom script I had buried deep within the virtual data room executed instantly. The standard corporate slideshow on the massive, wall-to-wall projection screen aggressively flickered and vanished. The room gasped as the display was forcefully hijacked from the main server. Instead of a neatly organized folder of compliant PDF files, the screen exploded with high-resolution images of the forged state engineering certificates. Then, the display began to auto-scroll. Next came the invoices from the cheap residential plumber, placed side by side with the glaring red error codes from the state registry database. Before anyone in the room could even process the fraudulent paperwork, the screen transitioned one final time. It pulled up the damning internal email Marcus had sent exactly 3 years ago, explicitly ordering the accounting department to bypass the safety protocols for a quick financial win. The digital timestamp and his verified electronic signature were blown up to 10 feet tall. Right beneath it, highlighted in blinding neon red, was the unyielding text of Clause 44B, spelling out the complete and immediate nullification of the building insurance. The silence that crashed down on the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a $500 million empire disintegrating in real time. The lead auditor from New York turned the color of wet ash. He stared at the screen, then slowly turned his gaze toward the Viridian Estates Board of Directors. He stood up, sharply buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "This building is completely uninsurable and currently operating under illegal, fraudulent safety certificates," the auditor announced, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "This entire transaction is completely void. We are leaving, and you should expect to hear from our legal counsel regarding this catastrophic waste of our time." The New York team marched out of the room in perfect unison, slamming the heavy glass doors behind them. Panic violently erupted. Marcus was shaking uncontrollably. The color had completely drained from his face as he scrambled frantically at the podium, desperately slamming his hand on the keyboard to shut the projection down. "It is a system glitch," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. He pointed a trembling finger wildly across the room at me. "She did this. She hacked the system. It is a complete lie." But the board members were not looking at me. They were staring at his undeniable digital signature projected in massive font on the wall, permanently confirming his guilt. The chief executive officer of Viridian Estates stood up, his face purple with rage, and picked up the desk phone to call building security. 10 minutes later, I watched with immense satisfaction as 2 burly guards grabbed Marcus by the arms and publicly frog-marched him through the lobby, tossing him out onto the street. He was no longer a rising corporate star. He was a disgraced criminal facing an immediate federal investigation. The very next morning, The chief executive officer called me into his penthouse suite. He looked exhausted, wiping sweat from his forehead. He practically begged me to stay. He offered me Marcus's vacant position on the spot, complete with an executive title and exactly triple my current salary, pleading with me to clean up the catastrophic mess left behind. I stood in front of his massive desk. I calmly reached up, unclipped my plastic employee badge, and placed it gently on the polished wood. Next to it, I laid down a single sheet of paper. It was my formal letter of resignation, printed and signed the night before. "I found the leak," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady and relentlessly polite. "But I have absolutely no obligation to fix your sinking ship." I turned my back on the chief executive officer, walked out of the glass doors, and stepped into the elevator. I left the burning empire entirely behind me, stepping out into the bright, crisp morning air with a clean conscience and total freedom. I want to sincerely thank you for listening to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know down in the comments. As a quick reminder, if you thought today's story was great and you want to support the channel, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. It helps us survive the YouTube demonetization, and it is the only place you can hear our absolute best, most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can scan the QR code on your screen right now, or use the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.